Now let's take a look at the midpoint formula. So if you recall from first semester, the midpoint is the point that divides a segment in half. So when you find a midpoint, if you're looking at the picture, it should be in the middle, hence midpoint, of the two endpoints. And it creates two congruent segments. So the distance from the midpoint to the first endpoint should be the same distance from the midpoint to the second endpoint. So it creates two congruent segments. So when you find something in the middle, you take the average. So the midpoint formula, you're going to average the x coordinates, so x1 plus x2 over 2, and then you're going to average the y coordinates, y1 plus y2 over 2. It's a pretty simple formula, just adding and dividing by 2. So in our first example, we're looking for the midpoint of GH, and we know the endpoints are 7, negative 5, and H, negative 9. So to find the midpoint, we are going to take the x values and add them together and divide by 2, and then we're going to take the y values and add them together as well and divide by 2. So 7 plus 9 is 16, and 16 divided by 2 is 8. Negative 5 plus negative 1 is negative 6, and negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. So your midpoint is 8, negative 3. Same type of problem, but now we are looking at a graph, so we need to make sure we correctly identify our endpoints. So the point on the left, we go left 5 and up 3, so that would be negative 5, 3. And the point on the right was left 2 and down 3, so that'd be negative 2, negative 3. So we're going to take our two x coordinates and add them together. So that would be negative 5 plus negative 2 over 2. And then we do the same thing with our y coordinates. Add the y coordinates and divide by 2. Now keep in mind, when you divide by 2, you could potentially get a fraction or decimal answer because not everything divides evenly. So don't panic if you do. And I'm fine with you either changing it to a decimal or keeping it as a fraction. So in this first one, when we add negative 5 and negative 2, we get negative 7 over 2. So there's a fraction that's not going to simplify. For the y coordinate, 3 plus negative 3 is 0, and 0 divided by 2 is going to be 0. So you can write this in two ways. You can leave it as negative 7 over 2, comma 0, or if you want to turn that to a decimal, negative 3.50. The nice thing about having a graph is you can kind of test and make sure that your endpoint makes, your midpoint makes sense. If you go to negative 3.5 on the graph, and then to 0, you can see it right here. It's not drawing very well, but there you go. And that definitely looks like it splits the graph in half. All right, Troop 175 is designing their new campground by first mapping everything on a coordinate grid. They have found a location for the mess hall and for their cabins. They want the bathrooms to be halfway between the two. What will the coordinates of the location of the bathroom? All right, so let's identify the coordinates of the mess hall. The mess hall would be negative 4, negative 1. And the cabins are at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 3. So if our bathrooms are halfway in between, that means they are at the midpoint. So let's use our midpoint formula. Let's add our x values and divide by 2. Add our y values and divide by 2. So negative 4 plus 6 is 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. And negative 1 plus 3 is 2. And 2 divided by 2 again is 1. So the bathrooms should be at 1, 1. Let's graph it and make sure that visually looks like it's in the middle. And it definitely does. All right, the last type of example that we're going to look at is where you're given the midpoint and one of the endpoints, but then you're looking for the other endpoint. So this is sometimes a little bit tricky. So it says find the coordinates of our if Q is the midpoint of PR and P has coordinates 5, 6. So I'm going to just kind of draw a picture, and it's not going to be like on the coordinate plane. I'm just literally just going to draw a horizontal segment. And let's see if we can kind of look at this. So find the coordinate R if Q is the midpoint and P has coordinates. Okay, so we've got 5, 6 for P, -1, 3, and we're looking for R. We don't know what it is. I'm just going to call it XY. What we do know is we have a midpoint formula, and we know that if we add the X coordinates of the endpoints, if we add X and 5 and divide by 2, it should equal the X coordinate of the midpoint. And the same thing is true for the Y coordinates. If I add the endpoints Y and 6 and divide by 2, I should get the Y value for the midpoint, which is 3. So I'm just going to solve these two equations. So if you want to think of this as cross multiplication, you certainly can. If it helps you to put it over 1 and cross multiply, it's the same thing. But essentially you're dividing by 2, so we need to make sure we do the opposite. So we are going to multiply both sides by 2. But that's essentially what cross multiplication is. All right, so the 2's on the left are going to cancel out, leaving you with x plus 5 equals, and then -1 times 2 is -2. Then we're going to subtract the 5, and that's going to give us our x coordinate, which is -7. Same thing for the y's. When I multiply by 2, that cancels out on the left, giving us y plus 6, and 3 times 2, that kind of looks more like 3 squared. Let me change that so it doesn't look like a square. 3 times 2 is 6. We're going to subtract 6, and y equals 0. So put this together, the coordinates of R are going to be -7, 0.